Hey everyone, Kibler here. Today I want to talk a little bit about the recent announcement regarding balance changes that are coming to Hearthstone. For those of you who aren't aware, Blizzard recently announced a number of cards that were going to be changed in an upcoming patch before the last call tournament, which means in about the next week. So pretty soon we'll have some changes that should hopefully shake up the metagame in Hearthstone standard format. I actually just did a video recently to talk about my thoughts on the state of competitive play, and some of that had to do with the current state of balance in Standard. So I'm glad to see that Blizzard has made some changes, and not huge ones, but some small ones to tweak the state of overall competitive balance. So let's start off just talking about Shaman. This is the class that kind of, if you've been either playing on ladder yourself or following any tournaments, you know that it's really sort of the big dog, the top competitor in the standard format right now. And it was actually the only class that had 2 cards changed. First of which is Rockbiter Weapon. Rockbiter Weapon is an interesting decision as far as cards to change are concerned. Part of the reason, according to the announcement that Rockbiter specifically was chosen to be changed was because it doubled as a burst tool in combination with other cards, specifically things like Alakir or Doomhammer. But also it's a very efficient card in terms of its removal effect. And that, I think, is actually the most powerful element of Rockbiter. It's been a 1-cost 3 damage removal spell, which gives essentially the best individual removal effect in the game as far as for small minions is concerned to Shaman, or at least it has for a long time. Now with the change from 1 to 2 mana, Shaman will no longer have access to nearly as much early game removal that can also double as late game burst. For instance, I think if there were a card that were just 1 mana 3 damage to a minion, maybe that's an okay card to exist in some class. The combination of the fact that it is 1 mana 3 damage to a minion, sometimes you have to take some damage to your face, but they can also double as a big burst card late in the game. It was just obviously super powerful. You almost never saw a Shaman deck without Rockbiter Weapon, unless it was a super control-oriented deck like the Ancestral Spirit Bog Champ style decks or whatever. So this, I think, is a pretty big change in terms of the implications it has for Shaman. It's going to make cards like Mana Worm or Tunnel Trog, amusingly enough, stronger because it's harder for anyone to answer them early in the game, and will definitely also help make mid-sized minions better against Shaman decks. One of the reasons that, for instance, Dragon Priest has kind of not been nearly as impactful as some people might think it would have been, sort of coming into the standard format, is cards like Rockbiter Weapon that allow the small minions in a Shaman deck to easily trade up into larger minions like Wormrest Agent or Twilight Guardian or whatever else. So I think that's going to be a very impactful change. We may see Shaman decks sort of shift in a number of ways, but that specific change to Rockbiter, I think, is going to downpower pretty much every current version of Shaman that we see, and I think it's a very good thing. The other change was, I think, less a power level change and more a frustration change. This is something I talked about a little bit in my previous video about sort of the emotional response that people have to random cards that have a huge gap between their best and worst cases. And Tuskar Totemic is exactly that. Tuskar Totemic is a card that, you know, when you see your opponent play Tuskar Totemic and you hear the ugh of a totem golem, that is exactly the sound that you make, which is just ugh, oh god, not again. So I'm definitely glad to see Tuskar Totemic changed. Specifically, I think that seeing play, because of its power level, in so many decks that didn't really care about the totems, in any way other than, well, sometimes you get a totem golem, and also this helps facilitate Thing from Below. You just had aggro Shaman decks that had Tuskar Totemic because it was sometimes just this insane power play by itself, and also helped facilitate the late game power in terms of these big turns involving Thing from Below. So that's, I think, a very good change. I think that we will still see Tuskar Totemic played in totem-focused decks, in decks that have, say, Wicked Witch Doctor, or have the Thunderbluff Valiant, or just looking to play, you know, sort of more of a mid-range, late-game totem-focused build, as opposed to every deck just playing Tuskar Totemic because it's so powerful. So I do think that Tuskar Totemic will show up in some decks, but won't be nearly as ubiquitous as it was before. All right, next up, we have Call of the Wild. This change is a little surprising to me, in part because this is a card that just came out. You know, we saw a change to Rockbiter Weapon. A lot of the argument for the change to Rockbiter Weapon is that it is a classic set card, and it's important that the classic set doesn't outshine the more recent expansion sets. I think I've talked a little bit about the importance of classic potentially rotating in the future, but it doesn't look like from these changes that that's a direction that Blizzard's going to go. Regardless, with Call of the Wild specifically, it's a card that just came out. And it seems like the sort of card that ought to be a card that you can evaluate fairly well from a development perspective. And the increase to 9 mana from 8 mana is a huge one. Not only is it 1 more mana, obviously, but it means that you can no longer use your hero power in the same turn when you play Call of the Wild. So it slows the card down dramatically, and it decreases the burst cap the card is potentially able to do, because you now can only do the 5 damage from Huffer attacking rather than the 7 damage from Huffer plus Steady Shot. And that's a really big deal. We look at, say, King Crush, the Hunter Legendary from the Classic set. It's a card that doesn't really see much play, and I think if King Crush were 1 mana cheaper and slightly smaller, it would be a card that saw a lot of play. Because if it were slightly smaller, but you could use your hero power alongside it, it would actually do more damage. It's kind of like King Crush compared to Leroy. It's like, well, Leroy actually does basically the same damage as far as your potential burst in a turn is concerned, because it allows you to use your hero power alongside it. So I think we're going to see the use of Call of the Wild drop pretty considerably. Right now, basically every Hunter deck includes 2 copies of Call of the Wild, and frankly, that's a big part of the reason that I think Blizzard decided to change it. When every single Hunter deck is built around a particular card, it probably means that you're doing something wrong. We actually saw a number of really aggressive Hunter decks that were basically Face Hunter, but also played Call of the Wild. So when your aggro deck is playing an 8-drop, it's probably a little bit more powerful than you initially anticipated. But I do think that we'll see significant decline in those sort of decks playing it. Probably won't play it at all. And mid-range Hunter decks may not play Call of the Wild or play fewer copies of Call of the Wild, simply because it's that much slower and that much more difficult to actually fit in as a sort of burst combo to end the game. The next card I want to talk about is Execute. And this is a card that I've seen a lot of people be like, why did they change Execute? Why didn't they change Fire War Axe? And I think, it's easier to change things in Execute, because increasing Execute from 1 cost to 2 cost doesn't fundamentally change the relationship of a lot of other things that exist in the game. If they were to change Fire War Axe, what do they change about it? It's a 3-attack, 2-cost weapon with 2 charges. What can you change that doesn't make that just worse than something else that exists when Warrior is supposed to be this sort of premier weapon class, as to whether Warrior should be the premier weapon class and the premier armor class and the premier so many other things class? That is an open question, but if you're assuming that sort of the design space that Warrior has is we are the weapon class, it makes sense for them to have, among their best cards, a very good weapon like Fire War Axe. Execute is a card that is sort of just obliquely powerful. It's just kind of on the fringes of what Warrior does. It's like, okay, we care about damaged minions. We care about doing things with damaged minions, whether it's damaging them, buffing damaged minions, drawing cards for damaged minions, or apparently killing damaged minions with Execute. And Execute has been one of the most powerful Warrior cards for a long time. It's one of the main reasons that you play Warrior in certain types of strategies, like Dragon Warrior, for instance, really leans on Execute in terms of offering you a tempo advantage in a lot of matchups. And I think that this is actually a very big change. It may seem like, it's only going from 1 to 2 mana. And this is something that I was sort of meaning to talk about regarding Rockbiter Weapon as well, but sort of the change between 1 and 2 mana is absolutely huge. Going from 1 mana to 2 mana means that not only can you not play it on turn 1, obviously you're not going to play Execute in turn 1, but that's relevant for Rockbiter Weapon, but you can fit it into fewer turns on your curve alongside other cards. 1 mana cards are some of the most important in Hearthstone, in really any game that uses a mana system, because they not only are things that you can do early, but they're things that you can combine in terms of your mana expenditure on a lot more turns. And specifically, Execute, you can play on-curve thing, coin, Execute in a lot of instances. You can play, slightly off-curve thing and execute your guy, and these can be enormous tempo swings in Warrior. And I think Execute is probably the second best warrior card behind Fiery War Axe. And the idea behind nerfing these cards, by the way, isn't necessarily this is the best card, we should make it worse. The idea, pretty clearly from the choices that that Blizzard made in terms of what they changed and the way in which they changed it, is we want to do something to overall reduce the power level of these classes that are pretty dominant in competitive play. And Execute is, one of the places you can go to make a card that is still potentially good, or at least pretty good, but doesn't, totally pull the rug out from under the class at the competitive level. So I think this is going to be a very big deal. In particular, I think it's really important for any kind of mid-range tempo style of warrior deck. I think it's less of an issue for the viability of controlling styles of warrior decks, because those often have floating mana on their turns, but tempo styles of warrior deck that rely on using Execute as a way to leverage that sort of tempo advantage in terms of getting ahead in the board and staying ahead in the board, I think you're going to probably get substantially weaker. Like Dragon Warrior in particular, I think is a deck that may just become bad because Execute costs 2 now. So it'll be interesting to see how that does shape up, but I think that this is a change that I like if we're going to make changes rather than rotate cards out. I think that slightly reducing the power level, it's a substantial reduction to power level. I say slightly reducing, but it looks slight. And that's one thing that, it's funny because people have talked about Blizzard's changes on a lot of cards in the past, and they're like, oh, they nuke them from orbit. They don't tweak them. But the change from 1 to 2 here is a dramatic change. You're doubling the cost of it, and you're really shifting its viability to tempo option as opposed to a more sort of hard removal option. And I think we're going to see a lot fewer decks that are leaning on Execute in order to make tempo plays. So. Moving along, we have Charge. And this is a card I think has actually confused some players when they look at the various changes. And part of it is, they look at, Worgen Warrior, it's not that powerful, it's a cool deck, combo deck, whatever. Why are they nerfing that? And the goal here is not nerfing Worgen Warrior. It does that, and frankly, I think that's a good thing, because I think that having one-turn kill combo decks that are as consistent and resilient as Worgen Warrior is probably a bad thing overall for Hearthstone. That has more to do with how easy it is to draw cards in Hearthstone consistently, specifically as a warrior deck, and less to do with how powerful Charge in particular is. But sort of a bigger point is that Charge is the kind of card that creates a design constraint on future cards. Charge is a card that was changed in beta because of the combination with Alexstrasza, which was not really palatable to the Blizzard developers and most of the community, really. But it's also a card that you may have a card that's like, when this does this thing, you get some awesome bonus. When this attacks, get some awesome bonus. Or something that, whatever. You could even have just a 1/1 minion that is like, when this damages a player, they die. It's like, it's a super cool card, but if Charge exists, then you're dead. Okay, well, we can't have this if Charge exists. So in sort of game design terms, you generally refer to that as a design constraint, because it's something that makes it impossible for you to make other cards. Like, I think that Warsong Commander was the reason, for instance, that Dreadsteed was a Warlock card. Because if you could give Charge to Dreadsteed, you would just keep attacking to all your opponent's guys infinitely, and there you go. So getting rid of Charge, or at least changing Charge such that you can't just attack your opponent directly with it, means that you can make other cards that could also be more interesting, and you can't necessarily make it in a world where Charge exists. So the change to Charge, I think, is good, because I think that you want to reduce the possibility for some of these consistent one-turn combo decks, and because it opens up potential designs that can be cool in the future. So definitely thumbs up on that one. And I actually think that this may now be a card that is more reasonable to play in a way that doesn't try and just kill people. You can play Sylvanas, charge it, attack your guy, steal your guy. And that's potentially kind of powerful. So it'll be interesting to see, because this isn't a card that was just nerfed. It was a card that was changed. And I think that it opens up new possibilities for how you might want to use this new Charge card that can't attack face. So kind of cool, and happy to see it. One of the last cards we have to talk about here is Abusive Sergeant. And this is kind of a funny card, because I remember when Standard Format was announced, I actually talked a bit about, generally my whole spiel on, I wish we would rotate cards rather than just, buff and nerf cards, yada, yada, yada. But I specifically mentioned Abusive Sergeant, because when Leper Gnome was nerfed, I was like, why is Leper Gnome, this sort of aggro card that's being nerfed? Because Abusive Sergeant is far more ubiquitous and far more powerful than Leper Gnome. Leper Gnome goes into decks that are just trying to kill the opponent as fast as possible, but Abusive Sergeant goes into any deck that is looking to play to the board quickly. And it's been a cornerstone card of Zoo, of aggressive Shaman decks, aggressive Hunter decks, all these decks. So the fact that it has just remained unscathed through the original nerfs in the standard format was kind of surprising to me. I felt like it was actually a more egregious fender in terms of showing up everywhere than Leper Gnome was. And, well, it seems like Blizzard has decided that Abusive Sergeant is, in fact, a card that needs to be reined in order to open up space for other cards, as well as generally reduce the power level of these aggressive decks. And this change, alongside, as I mentioned, the Execute change and the Rockbiter change, I think goes a long way to make mid-sized minions much stronger. We in many cases, I found when I was playing, like, say, Dragon Priest, that, playing against almost any position, because, I play, say, a Twilight Whelp against my opponent's Argent Squire. It's like, okay, Abusive Sergeant, kill your guy, and now I'm ahead, and you're behind. It's like, oh, okay. And, or they just Rockbiter my guy, or whatever. So many ways that they just get an advantage over me spending my mana trying to do something, which feels like it ought to be powerful. And now, with these changes to Rockbiter, Execute, and Abusive Sergeant, I feel like those mid-sized minions are likely to be much more effective because there are so many fewer ways to powerfully, naturally gain a tempo advantage against an opponent who plays an individual big minion. There's still going to be stuff like Soulfire or Power Overwhelming, but reducing the amount of powerful, viable attack boosts, I think, is a good thing to encourage decks to play more to sort of middle of the road in terms of the sizes of their minions, and I think that makes a lot of decks potentially more viable. Definitely like the Abusive Sergeant change, and think that this is one of the more impactful ones we'll see, just because I think this significantly reduces the power level of a lot of aggressive decks. This is a card that we may still see in, say, Zoo. I think that Zoo is definitely a deck that is happy to play things that are somewhat underpowered in order to take advantage of the tempo it's able to spew out in the board by just playing a lot of cheap things and then refill with life tap. I think that we'll see fewer Abusive Sergeants, perhaps no Abusive Sergeants, in decks like Aggro Shaman or Hunter, simply because those decks care much more about how much value they're getting out of their resources and can't really necessarily afford to just play 1/1s that might be too low impact if they don't get a good hit with the attack boost. All right, and last but certainly not least is Yogg-Saron. Now, Yogg-Saron, on a text level, didn't change. And this, I think, is actually kind of confusing, because if a player who doesn't read the buffs, nerf sort of stuff, just plays their Yogg-Saron, and it works completely differently than before, but the card looks the same, that's weird. So I hope that Blizzard does a really good job of in-client messaging in terms of the update to Yogg-Saron. For those of you who may not have been paying attention to the update, by the way, speaking of knowing how it works, Yogg now stops casting spells if it dies, returns to hand, or is transformed, or is silenced, which is a really weird one. It's a battle cry effect that can be silenced by itself, when silences don't really do stuff on battle cries in general, but I don't know. That one feels a little strange to me. It's like, okay, when he stops being an old god, he stops casting spells. Sure, he's dead, he's a frog, he's Frog-Saron, whatever. But him being silenced, I think this kind of feels like just a way to just force people to be even more mad at Purify. Like, their Yogg just casts Purify first spell, and they're like, oh my god, Purify, I knew I hated that card, I can't believe it! But, in general, I actually really like this change. I would love to, for Yogg to have been able to stay the way that it was, but I understand that the competitive community in general is really unhappy with the implications that the card had, given how much it was showing up in competitive play. And this change is one that actually doesn't change the way Yogg works in a lot of games. I was playing a bunch of games on my stream, which was sort of my going away stream for Yogg, just playing all Yogg decks all day, all sorts of different decks. And so many games, like, my Yogg would just survive the entire casting of all of the spells without being silenced, transformed, returned to hand, killed, whatever. And it was funny. I was joking that Yogg previously he knew everyone hated him. He was really down on himself. Just kept blowing himself up every time he cast all these spells. But now people are like, oh, hooray, we don't hate Yogg anymore. He was just feeling good about his life and wanted to stick around. But what I do think this does for Yogg is create a level of volatility in terms of the results that make it much, much less attractive to put into a high-level competitive deck. And as much as I would have loved for Yogg to have been able to stay the same, for a lot of cases this just does make it the same, as I was just mentioning, but it ensures that players don't decide, okay, I feel like I have to play Yogg in this deck because Yogg is just so powerful and does so much when I, build up enough spells that I want to play it. Because it really increases the chances that the card does little to nothing. Previously, it was like, yeah, sometimes you could play Astral Communion, sometimes you could kill your own stuff, but if you were behind in a game and you played Yogg, you were almost guaranteed to get some significant value out of it. But now, the fact that it can literally do nothing, like you play it and immediately flamelands itself and your turn's over, that's a huge, huge risk and a huge, huge cost that I think will very likely keep it out of a lot of top-level competitive decks. And that's the goal. The goal isn't to get Yogg out of Hearthstone. The goal is to get Yogg out of high-level tournament play and people feeling like those high-level tournament matches are undermined by this enormous random element. So I really am happy with this particular change and hope that it does enough and people don't keep ranting and raving about how much they hate Yogg, and really hope that it doesn't suddenly show up at BlizzCon and win the whole thing and start this whole process over again. So anyway, that is it as far as my overall thoughts on all those changes. Big picture, I think they did a great job. Bigger picture, I would rather we saw rotations and new cards being injected and some of these cards just being moved out of the environment rather than changed in a way that makes them no longer sort of what people have come to know these cards as. Sort of a lot of my feeling regarding the wild format that I mentioned in my previous video. I'd love to be able to play the decks that, old Zoo, old Control Warrior, whatever. It's like these are no longer going to be the same decks that they were for players who were fans of them because of changes to cards like Execute or Abusive Sergeant or whatever. So I think that given the framework of we are, progressively, incrementally changing some cards in the Classic set in order to cause shifts in the Standard environment, I think this is about as good a job as Blizzard could have done with these changes, so I'm very, very happy with them, and I'm really excited to see how the metagame shapes up in the near future. So that is it. Thank you guys for watching. Let me know what you think of the changes, and I'll see you next time.